What is the truth about MAiD or medically assisted death in Canada? I'm Dr. Christy Gibson. This is a series I'm doing called Hot Takes on Cool Topics, and I am very well positioned to talk about this because I've actually been a MAiD assessor and provider since it was legal in Canada, which is almost 10 years now, since 2016. A couple of years ago, I was speaking in Ireland at a Dying with Dignity World event because there's a lot of changes going on in the UK where they're considering terminally ill patients being allowed the right to request a medically assisted death. And this isn't something that has existed in their laws before, so there's a lot of hot debate on it. And it was really interesting to me because they told me that there was these documentaries showing just how far Canada has gone and how bad things are and how dangerous and unethical our practices are. I was like, wow, that's news to me. That's definitely not what I see on the ground. So let me clear up some misinformation. So yes, in 2021, Canada did change from just allowing folks with life-limited illnesses, so people who were going to die imminently, they opened it up to something called Track 2 cases, which means that you can have a chronic illness that's also causing tremendous suffering that can't be alleviated by treatments that you deem acceptable. And that chronic disease, which cannot be mental at this point, that would allow you to apply for MAiD. Not necessarily be found eligible, but you could put forward the application. So that was definitely a concern amongst the Canadian population. And what I hear a lot on social media is that people are being coerced into MAiD. So there's two positions on that. One is that if you have a disability, that those of us in healthcare will suggest MAiD to you as saying like this would be one way to manage it and kind of hinting that you should be taking this exit. There was a case of a veteran who was told, I think by a nurse or administrator, that this would be an option for them. So that hit the news and it hit people hard because, I mean, that is horrifying. And I can promise you that this is not something that is collectively happening. None of us are being told that we should be mentioning it to folks who have chronic illness or disability. And certainly, unless they are expressing, this is so intolerable, my suffering is so bad that I want to exit, it's not something that we just suggest out of nowhere. So these stories that hit the media, I'm not saying that they're not true, but I'm saying it's literally 1 in a million. It's not something that's happening frequently. And I can understand the fear in the disability community because they're also facing cuts to their benefits and programming and all these other things where they feel like society is telling them you don't matter. But I promise you, as a physician, you matter. This is not something I would wish for anybody, is that level of intolerable suffering where they feel like they have no other options. I also think it's important to note that in that second category of vulnerability, there's these people who might be facing poverty or other kinds of structural determinants of health or social determinants of health that are causing their pain and suffering, their distress to be worse. And I think it's important to not deny folks who are facing that the option of searching MAiD while we as healthcare workers and professionals advocate strongly on their behalf to improve their social situations. So I'm always talking about housing first policies, basic income. This is all in my book, The Modern Trauma Toolkit, but I really do think that we can advocate for a stronger social safety net, but not force people to say, well, just stick around in case that happens if they really don't want to. This is autonomy, it's their choice. The other thing that I'm hearing is this slippery slope regarding mental health. And it's interesting because in 2021, the federal government was actually forced to open up this Track 2 because of a court case finding, a patient who challenged the constitutionality of having to have a life-limiting disease to be able to access medically assisted death. So it wasn't the doctors pushing, it wasn't the government pushing, it was the population, it was the public pushing for this. And so the court said to the federal government, you have to sort this out. You have to create a track for people who don't have life-limiting illnesses. You also have to create a track for mental health as a sole condition. You also have to look at advanced directives. So people who have dementia and would lose capacity before MAiD would be enacted, what do we do about that? And then mature minors. So kids, generally this would be kids who have cancer. And it is so important to note that for track 2 MAiD, this is 96% of MAiD is track 1, life-limiting disease. So 3-4% of MAiD is track 2. So when people say that kids with chronic disease would be offered MAiD, absolutely not. I can promise you as a practitioner, I would not even remotely consider that. These would be kids who have life-limiting conditions who might be considered for MAiD in the future. So I've been really hesitant around mental health myself, and I can understand the perspective of that if your mental health is so bad that you want to die by suicide, this would be a more humane way to go. That makes sense to me, and a part of me gets behind that, but there's this other part that is just so upset that we don't have universal access to adequate mental health care, especially in the context of trauma healing, that I just don't think we should be offering as a government or as healthcare workers the option of dying instead of the option of thriving first. And even as I say that, I recognize that this is kind of paternalistic because it's very similar to my concerns around structural violence and a lack of social determinants of health. Like if you're stuck in poverty, I shouldn't force you to stay there just in the hopes that we're going to improve things. And the same case can be made around mental health, but because I do so much trauma therapy as a practitioner now, I just see this as something that we should be rolling out as a universal competency for all family physicians and primary care providers. And until we do that, I just find it unethical that we might offer MAiD first until we actually have more universal access. So that is something that I'm working on. The last thing I want to mention in this introductory video, and if you want me to go through it in detail with the actual form next to me, I totally will. But the process itself has a lot of checks and balances. So first, the patient has to request it. Nobody can request it on their behalf, and it has to be signed by somebody who's not going to benefit from their death. There's 2 physicians or nurse practitioners who do the assessment. We do it independently. We don't share information or opinions prior to coming up with our decision about eligibility. And the criteria are so strict. You have to have a serious and incurable chronic condition that is causing intolerable suffering. And we do a really stringent interview to make sure that that's the case. It's interesting, and I really appreciate this to be true. The suffering doesn't have to be just physical suffering. So definitely pain, shortness of breath, bowel issues, all of that stuff is definitely considered. But we also talk about a loss of dignity, a loss of being able to do the things that make your life meaningful, not being able to do the daily activities of life like grooming and bathing and feeding yourself and all of those things that make a person feel more human. And one of the things that I see quite often is a person would have the option in front of them of going to a nursing home or a long-term care facility, or they might choose medically assisted death instead because they say, I never wanted that for myself. That to me is not sufficient quality of life. And I like that Canada has that as a decision that people can make and use their own agency and decide what's intolerable to them. And we just listen to them and their subjective opinion on that, and we believe them. We also assess capacity. So we make sure there's no coercion, that this is a voluntary decision, and that they have the capacity to make an informed choice around medically assisted death. So is there any evidence of dementia or delirium? Do they consistently ask for this and understand what's being asked? So we are not trying to get people to accept it. We're actually trying to make sure that they are asking for it and that they're asking for it consistently and in strong mental capacity to do so. There's extra checks and balances for track 2 MAiD, which I could get into, but let me know if you want me to go through the whole form and the process in another video. That's an intro to MAiD in Canada. I actually think it's pretty reasonable. I think it's safe. Could we improve our processes? Heck yeah. But the intention of it is to create autonomy and agency for folks that are suffering.